The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in Him. Therefore I will hope in Him.
Good morning. Welcome to our study in Acts. My name is Clint McElroy, and this morning we'll be studying Acts chapter 24. As I've said in times past, I am a sinner, and I hope that you will not forget that as we enter into this study. I am someone who depends on the righteousness of Jesus Christ and His faithfulness toward me, His sacrifice for my salvation, for my righteousness before God. So do not be surprised if I talk about sin in a personal way, because it has affected me and it affects those I love. And I want you to understand that before we go into this study together. Also, you should not trust that everything I say about the Word is true. You should not trust that from any source except the Word itself. Study the Word, and if you find anything that I have said to be inconsistent with what the Word says, then I do hope that you will contact me and let me know. And we can turn to the Word and look to it together and find out what the Word truly says together. These are my personal goals, my personal standards for Bible studies. I don't expect you to just trust me at my word. I will offer opinion quite frequently. Most everything I say will be in some way, form, or fashion an opinion, except, of course, the reading of the Word itself. So I hope that you will be able to be encouraged by the things that we've said in the past, and also the things we continue to say as we enter into these studies together. And I hope that we'll be able to have a conversation about this at some point. I'm still not clear on how, but we will get that done at some point and have that prepared and released. So that is the goal. And of course, I try to remember to mention the story of the two individuals on the road to Emmaus who, when they found themselves in the presence of Jesus unknowingly, they recognized that there was a burning in their heart because of the experience of being with Jesus. And I feel like that's a feeling we can kindle in our own hearts by approaching His Word and studying it, making ourselves close to it, conforming to it, if you will, conforming to the patterns of the stories that we find there about how to behave ourselves as disciples of Christ. And I hope that's your personal goal in entering into this study. And if it is, then I hope God's blessings will be upon you as we move forward. So we will proceed with the reading, and then we'll talk about what we find in the Scriptures. I'll be reading out of the NIV from Acts chapter 24. 5 days later, the high priest Ananias went down to Caesarea with some of the elders and a lawyer named Tertullus, and they brought their charges against Paul before the governor. When Paul was called in, Tertullus presented his case before Felix. "We have enjoyed a long period of peace under you, and your foresight has brought about reforms in this nation. Everywhere and in every way, most excellent Felix, we acknowledge this with profound gratitude." Verse 4, "But in order not to weary you further, I would request that you be kind enough to hear us briefly. We have found this man to be a troublemaker, stirring up riots among the Jews all over the world. He is a ringleader of the Nazarene sect, and even tried to desecrate the temple, so we seized him. By examining him yourself, you will be able to learn the truth about all these charges we are bringing against him." Verse 9, "The other Jews joined in the accusation, asserting that these things were true. When the governor motioned for him to speak, Paul replied, 'I know that for a number of years you have been a judge over this nation, so I gladly make my defense. You can easily verify that no more than 12 days ago I went up to Jerusalem to worship." Verse 12, "My accusers did not find me arguing with anyone at the temple or stirring up a crowd in the synagogues or anywhere else in the city. and they cannot prove to you the charges they are now making against me. However, I admit that I worship the God of our ancestors as a follower of the way, which they call a sect. I believe everything that is in accordance with the law and that is written in the prophets, and I have the same hope in God as these men themselves have, that there will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. So I strive always to keep my conscience clear before God and man. Verse 17. After an absence of several years, I came to Jerusalem to bring my people gifts for the poor and to present offerings. I was ceremonially clean when they found me in the temple courts doing this. There was no crowd with me, nor was I involved in any disturbance. But there are some Jews from the province of Asia who ought to be here before you and bring charges if they have anything against me. Verse 20. Or these who are here should state what crime they found in me when I stood before the Sanhedrin, unless it was this one thing. I shouted as I stood in their presence. It is concerning the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial before you today. Verse 22. Then Felix, who was well acquainted with the way, adjourned the proceedings. When Lysias the commander comes, he said, I will decide your case. He ordered the centurion to keep Paul under guard, but to give him some freedom and permit his friends to take care of his needs. Several days later, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish. He sent for Paul and listened to him as he spoke about faith in Christ Jesus. As Paul talked about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix was afraid and said, That's enough for now. You may leave. When I find it convenient, I will send for you. Verse 26. At the same time, he was hoping that Paul would offer him a bribe, so he sent for him frequently and talked with him. When 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, but because Felix wanted to grant a favor to the Jews, he left Paul in prison. Okay, so last week we read the story about how Paul gets moved out of Jerusalem. It starts with the convening of the Sanhedrin by the Roman guard Lysias, the commander of the detachment that had rescued Paul from basically the riot at the temple when he was taken. They convened, and there was a little altercation between Paul and what turned out to be the high priest, and we had some discussions about having respect for our leaders. Then Paul used the situation between the Pharisees and the Sadducees to manipulate the group that presented themselves there and find favor with the Pharisees while alienating the Sadducees by claiming that he was being persecuted because of his belief in the resurrection, which the Pharisees also believed in. This ended the situation there. The commander withdrew, taking Paul into the barracks to protect him. There was a brief discussion about the nature of a plot made by the Jews against him. Some had taken a vow to kill Paul, and this became known to Paul's sister's son, his nephew, who let Paul know, and Paul directed him to the commander, and the commander prepared a detachment to carry Paul to the regional governor and wrote a note. We talked about that note, and we find at the end that Paul has been taken into Herod's building there in Caesarea, and that's where we leave off. So we move on into chapter 24, where Felix has convened a trial after 5 days. He has basically the Sanhedrin representatives come down. They bring an orator named Tertullus to basically to prosecute their charges against Paul. And he begins by, and I'll read this out of the New King James, and there are passages here that are in the New King James that are not in the NIV, so bear with me in that regard. starting partway through verse 2, seeing that that through you we enjoy great peace and prosperity is being brought to this nation by your foresight, we accept it always and in all places, most noble Felix, with all thankfulness. Nevertheless, not to be tedious to you any further, I beg you to hear by your courtesy a few words from us, for we have found this man a plague, a creator of dissension among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, and we seized him, and wanted to judge him according to our law. But the commander Lysias came by, and with great violence took him out of our hands, commanding his accusers to come to you. By examining him yourself, you may ascertain all these things of which we accuse him. So that was his statement, and the additional verse there is verse 7, which explains their disposition toward Lysias, the commander of the Roman detachment, because of the violence in which Paul was taken into protection. This happened 2 or 3 times, so it's hard to really blame. It's hard to fathom that they would expect that blame would fall exclusively upon Paul, but that was their expectation. Now everything else you could say that while it's misrepresentation of the situation, is true from their perspective. Let's go over those things a little bit here. We have found this man a plague. They certainly did find him a plague. He was certainly bothering them every place that he went. A creator of dissension among all the Jews throughout the world. Every place he went, the Jews seemed to rise up in dissension against him, and causes disruptions even among the communities outside of their own environment. So it is not untrue what they're saying here. A ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. Well, they considered the way a sect of the Nazarenes, and he was certainly one of the leaders, what they would have perceived of as a leader, although he wasn't the kind of leader that we would think of as a leader. He was a traveling preacher. He was not an elder or one who directed activities. He was someone who engaged in activities. So in that way, he was a leader. And then their final accusation was that he tried to profane the temple when he was seized, which we know, according to the story, is not true. He was engaged in the purification rites. He had been a week doing those things according to the law and was presenting himself clean before the priests in the temple, which was part of the rite. So in no way did he actually profane the temple, but we also remember that there were those present among the Jews who thought he had brought a Gentile in to the temple, where he had been seen in Jerusalem with Gentiles, so they assumed that there were Gentiles with him in the temple, which was apparently not true. So that part of their accusation was not true. And Lysias did come with violence. It talks about it in the previous passages that there was a significant measure of violence, but it's not clear on whose part the violence is credited. There was violence in the circumstance, but it sounds like in the circumstance descriptions in the other passages that the Jewish people were engaged in violence toward Paul, and possibly even each other, as he on occasion would move some to defend his position from one place to another. And it is interesting how this progresses from one place to another. That's an interesting way of looking at these few chapters. Each time Paul makes a defense in a different place to a different group of people, he is using that opportunity to present the Word of God. They use language that would try to move Felix into their court. Flowery language meant to manipulate his disposition, which is not unlike what we see in our courts today. Then it goes on. Paul starts, and he responds. He also kind of says some things that are nice about Felix. He recognizes that his years of service have not been bad. And he makes his defense. His statement is basically, no more than 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem to worship, and they neither found me in the temple disputing with anyone or inciting the crowds. That's not why he was there. He was there for the purpose of presenting himself to the priest in accordance with the purification rites. And he makes that point that they can't prove that anything that they've accused him of is true. But he does confess that when he was challenged, he used the disposition of certain members of that crowd toward the resurrection in a way that might have fostered the arguments that erupted. So he does owe up to something that I wouldn't even consider him guilty of. I mean, that's just his common sense to make your stand in such a way that you win defenders, and that's certainly what he did. And he makes that clear that he did do that. He doesn't deny what he might have actually done. And he says in verse 16, I myself always strive to have conscience without offense toward God and men, which is a good way to live. It's always good to live your life in such a way that no man can make accusation against you, and certainly to live in such a way that God would not be able to make accusation against you. So in verse 17 is where he actually makes that statement about the resurrection of the dead being something that he did do that may have had an impact on the peaceable assembly of the people there when he made this statement. And he also goes into the details about those that really had the original objection were not there to present their argument in verse 19. They ought to have been here before you to object if they had anything against me. So the people that were there were not the people that were there in the temple the day that he was originally taken. And that's an important point. The accusers that really started everything were not even present. So, having clarified all that, and I'll have to edit out some of the things that I said because I got lost in the passage myself. But in verse 22, when Felix heard these things, having more accurate knowledge of the way, he adjourned the proceedings and said, when Lysias, the commander, comes down, I will make a decision in your case. So he kind of defers, expecting that Lysias would come and help explain the situation. But that was just an excuse, apparently, because he, after commanding that Paul be taken away and given a measure of liberty but not free, he kept him there many days and had him present himself to himself and his wife, Drusilla, who was Jewish, and heard many things. But one of the things that Paul eventually mentioned about righteousness and self-control and the judgment to come made Felix a little bit upset, and it's understandable when people who may not be living in the correct way hear that God has standards that he will hold people to regardless of whether or not they believe in him or understand those standards. It is upsetting, especially if they're not willing to make changes to accommodate those standards, which is all God expects. When you hear that he has a standard, that you try to find out what that standard is and live up to it. And he doesn't leave you hanging there. I mean, that's why Jesus was given up on the cross of Calvary, so that we would have an advocate, and that we would have someone who lived and walked in our path, who would be able to stand in our place for that judgment that should be against us. So it's no simple thing, and it's no particularly hard thing on our part. We just have to acknowledge that and change our ways. But he made the famous statement, go away for now, and when I have a more convenient time, I'll call on you. It speaks also to his secondary expectation that Paul might offer him a bribe, but Paul never did. And he kept him there for 2 years and conversed with him from time to time, but there's no indication that Felix ever responded to the message in an appropriate way. And when he finally did leave this office and Porcius Festus took over, he wanted to do the Jews a favor. So that speaks to the political situation that sometimes, I know in the past I never really paid much attention to it, but if he wanted to do the Jews a favor, there was a reason why he wanted to do the Jews a favor, and it speaks to some of the political machinations that were going on in the region at the time. And he left Paul in prison for the time being because of that. And we'll go on into chapter 25 and talk about what happens next time. But I did want to kind of talk about something I did find in the commentary. And again, the book is N.T. Wright's book on Acts, where he expounds a little bit on Felix. He notes here in his notes that Felix was born a slave, which I did not realize, and had been given his freedom and was possibly given command by Emperor Claudius, because having been a slave and given his freedom, Claudius expected that freedman would be more loyal to him than he would have, but than perhaps another person might have been. So it also speaks to his term in office being between 52 AD and 59 AD, and we know that's from coinage that was minted during that period, and it helps us date again this time period. So we have a couple of hard dates now that we've found in Acts based on events that we know in history when they occurred. So it helps us really put the time frame in the right perspective. And he speaks here also about the discontent that the Jews had toward the Roman overlords, and that also that Felix was not that great a governor according to the historical record. In that regard, he did things that made the Jews upset with him. So that perhaps explains some of the disposition we find he had toward the Jews in verse 27 of chapter 24. But you have to read between the lines to get some of that, and I'm not real good at it. I've done more of it in this study of Acts than I've ever done before. I'm not sure the value of it, but it does have some value, at least to give us some perspective on the circumstance that everything unveiled itself in. So speaking then again about what we can take away from this when we find ourselves in situations of trial, and we should find ourselves in situation of trial if we are living according to what God would have us do. We are not going to live peaceful lives of happiness and joy without any problems. We're going to have problems because people don't like it when people are content. They don't like it when people don't do the same things they do in their day-to-day lives. So there will be challenges, and when those challenges present themselves in our lives, how are we going to avail ourselves of those challenges? We either yield to temptation and lay down, or we stand up for Christ and make his word known to populations that perhaps did not know his will before that encounter. So that's our opportunity. Every challenge we face in life is an opportunity to represent Christ before men. As Christians, we have that duty. That's our duty. That's what we're supposed to do. And if we do it, we've done just what we were supposed to do. So that's our calling, that's our commission. We are commissioned to live our lives for Christ as he was sacrificed for our sin and goes up to death for us on our behalf because of our sin. We live our lives on his behalf in this world. So his acts continued in Acts after his death because of the church and the apostles and the deeds of the early Christians, and his acts continue this day because of present-day Christians working in the lives of men to do the Lord's will. That's what we're obliged to do. It's interesting to see it here and the way it's presented each individual trial, a literal trial in this case, and how Paul avails himself of each situation in slightly different ways, taking advantage of his privilege as a Roman citizen, taking advantage of his education as a Jewish Pharisee, very versed in the ways of the Pharisees, taking advantage of each opportunity that presented itself. That's what we should be doing as well. And he waited, and that's the other thing that kind of came out in the commentary, and I wanted to make a point on, because in the commentary, which was written I don't know how long ago, it talks about, have you ever found yourself waiting? Well, how perfectly suited for this time is that statement. We're all kind of waiting around for this lockdown, these restrictions that have been placed on us to expire in a way that we can all recognize as safe, and we're kind of on hold. And it's very hard to wait and to be called on to wait upon the Lord to solve problems in our own lives. It's very difficult to do, and we see time and again through Scripture where men chose to find their own solutions for problems that they had presented to God or found themselves in because of God, instead of waiting for God to work those things out in their lives, or going to God to find direction for those things. And how much trouble did they find themselves in because of that? From Abraham, Moses, the children of Israel as they entered the promised land, just time and again, people were not willing to wait. Good people, people that are held up as examples of the way we should behave in some regards, in other regards found themselves doing things improperly and suffering for it. So what are our expectations for ourselves? Are we going to be perfect? Well, we want to be perfect. We want to do those things that are in accordance with God's will and to make Him happy with us. But we're not going to be doing that perfectly. And He knows that. He's made provision for that in the blood of Jesus Christ. So we can still, if we seek to serve God, walk with faithful hope in the resurrection, that we will experience and be one with the Lord on that day of judgment. Not because of our own good works, but because of His faithfulness toward us. Because He is true to His word. He will do what He promised to do. We just have to try. And we have to make those changes in our lives that are appropriate and follow through with that. And we're going to make mistakes, but that's accounted for. So don't use that as a justification to sin. That's the whole point. Don't sin. But when you have sin in your life, don't pretend it's not there. Do something about it. Get it out of your life. And do what the Lord would have us to do. I hope that you found some encouragement today in this study, and we will continue this going forward. And again, thanks go out to everybody who's worked so hard to continue our meetings in absentia. It's been very troubling and a trial in and of itself, but I'm very thankful for Gary and for Scott and for so many others. The lady who's cleaning our building, she's still cleaning the building. I've seen her up there. So it's been very good. It's very encouraging, and I hope that you will find some encouragement too. God bless you, and have a good week.